All right, are we on? Okay. So I understand that this is being recorded. This is the part where you get the disclaimer, right? So the views and opinions expressed by the host today do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the staff or the management of the state of Ohio. So that's probably the best way to do this. So as we get further into this, and you know, if I would happen to editorialize on any particular rule, maybe not get myself in too much trouble, especially since it's being recorded. So what we'll try and do is we'll look at, let's see, what's the makeup of our audience here? How many agency people? Couple, like farm retailer or co-op or CLM type folks. Any farmers? Okay, so no farmer. Okay, so mostly retail or fertilizer industry or agency folks. So we'll try and kind of talk about things in terms that you might be interested in then. We'll go back through a little bit. The easiest way really to do this is to kind of go back in time a little bit and look at the history of what the regulations look like in Ohio, and then we'll kind of roll through and finish up with what's happening right now or what's happened recently from a regulatory standpoint in Ohio, and then try and at least make a little bit of an assessment on whether or not any of that is helping anything. I thought, whoops, what happened? Ah, I see that. Gotcha. Okay. So we were on a family camping trip. I thought, there's not going to be anything to talk about on this subject. This is really dull, and there's nothing really exciting going on with nutrient management regulation in Ohio. And then we were on a family camping trip 3 weeks ago, 3.5 weeks ago, and one of the directors for the Ohio Federation of Soil and Water Conservation Districts texted me this. And I'm like, what in the world is going on? So on a Friday afternoon, Governor Kasich, and you guys all know Governor Kasich. I mean, he ran for president, so everybody knows who John Kasich is. On a Friday afternoon, he called his director for the Department of Agriculture into the office 3 weeks ago and said, I no longer need your services. And keep in mind that there are only 2 months left in the governor's term, okay? He's term limited out and not going to be governor anymore. But with 2 months to go, he felt that he needed to terminate his longstanding director for the Ohio Department of Agriculture. And so I thought, well, maybe there are some things going on in Ohio that folks would like to know about. So this is what nutrient management regulation and on-farm pollution looks like in the state of Ohio, okay? And if you think it looks like a mess, you ought to be somehow involved in trying to implement part of it on the ground. We've got the Ohio Administrative Code, the Ohio Revised Code, certain federal code of regulation or code of federal regulation issues. Of course, we've got different legislative efforts that are going on all the time. We have Ohio EPA, Ohio Department of Natural Resources, Ohio Department of Agriculture, Ohio Soil and Water Conservation Districts, all involved in this on-farm nutrient management and pollution abatement regulation issue. And I didn't realize how appropriate this slide was going to be today. Yeah. It's the same thing in Ohio. It's that way. Every state's that way, isn't it? Okay, if you don't like the weather, just wait a few minutes. It's going to change. Right now, with the pollution abatement rule situation in Ohio, that's where we're at right now with our pollution abatement rules. If you don't like them, just wait a few minutes. They're probably going to change. Now, whether or not they change for the better is a matter of perspective. Whether you happen to be a farmer, a fertilizer dealer, or an agency staff person or some sort of elected official, whether we're changing all of those things for the better or not is kind of a little bit of a matter of opinion. So rule categories in Ohio. This is kind of the way that we lump things all together, okay? We've got large, small and medium livestock operations, and we do that way because that's just the way we lump it all together. So small and medium confined animal, small livestock operations, medium confined animal feeding operations, we treat those all the same in Ohio, no difference. Large confined animal feeding operations, and then fertilizer is kind of the, the Johnny-come-lately ugly stepchild out here to the side that everybody is still trying to figure out exactly what we're going to do with and how we're going to regulate that in the state. So we'll kind of go through things in reverse order with each one of those. So from a fertilizer standpoint, and it's important to note that everything that we'll talk about here has to do with farm operations type regulation. Okay, so this doesn't apply to the commercial applicator regulations that might be enforced for a farm co-op or something like that that's applying manure or fertilizer for a large number of customers. Senate Bill 150 was passed in Ohio in May of 2014, and that legislation basically said that every person in Ohio that's applying fertilizer to more than 50 acres for crop production for crops for sale must have a fertilizer certification in order to be able to do so. Why it was exempt, I don't know, but people who were applying only starter fertilizer were exempt from having to have that certification. So you could be farming 500 acres if you had a livestock operation and you were getting all of your P and K and most of your N from your livestock manure, and the only other thing that you were putting on was starter fertilizer, then you're exempt from this requirement. That doesn't make a lot of sense, I know, but that's, in the legislature's wisdom, that's the way that it ended up. The deadline for certification was basically just a year ago, so by September 2017, everybody in the state that met those requirements had to be certified. That certification was taken care of by Ohio State University. They already had a certification program for our pesticide applicator program, and they just rolled those two together. So all of the wise fertilizer use, correctly calculating fertilizer or manure nutrient values, how to properly apply fertilizer, considerations for conservation practices that can help avoid fertilizer runoff, and all of those sorts of things were all rolled into that 3-hour training as part of that pesticide applicator program. And so that's how they accomplished that by and large in the state of Ohio. Estimates were, when they rolled the program out, or when they rolled the legislation out, that there were about 20,000 farmers in the state that would have to have that certification. Even though it does not include, the rule package does not include starter fertilizer, it does include sidegrass applications. So if you're coming back and putting nitrogen on corn or wheat, for example, then you would have to have that certification if you're doing that on more than 50 acres. The rules compel the certificate holder to maintain mandatory records. So you have to keep records, and you have to keep those for a 3-year period. And it is on the way they're checking up on that is a random spot check process. That's the way that they've taken care of the pesticide certification program in the state of Ohio, and the records that are required for that it's a random spot check, and ODA personnel will just show up at the farm someday and say, hey, show us your pesticide applicator records. Oh, by the way, now show us your fertilizer application records as well. And you're required to keep those, in both programs, you're required to keep those for 3 years. One thing that was different about, and we talked about this in the earlier session today, one thing that was different about the record-keeping process was that for our pesticide applicator program, operators were required to get the weather data at the time. All they had to record was the weather data at the time of the application. So what's it doing right now? For the fertilizer certification program, all of a sudden they had to be looking at the forecast data. So at the time you're going to make a fertilizer application, you have to log what the weather forecast is, especially for precipitation, but there are a number of other things that they like to have too. But especially that precipitation forecast at the time the application is being made. So penalties. At the time, this is our then Director of Agriculture. Still got to get used to that now that we're only weeks into this. But his quote at the time, "We preach compliance, not wanting to beat the requirement over anybody's head," said Director Daniels. "If you're caught applying fertilizer without the certification, we're going to ask you to get off the tractor." We want to work with those individuals that might not really know of the requirement. But then again, if they simply refuse, we have the ability to file a misdemeanor charge with the county prosecutor. Kind of a level-headed approach to on-farm regulation, we thought. I mean, he's had always been a pretty good guy to work with. Their large confined animal feeding operation permitting program, which runs through ODA in Ohio, we'll talk about that in a second. A very straightforward, very practical approach to regulation. That's probably in part what got him crosswise with the governor. The governor had issued an executive order that we'll talk about here in a second, compelling the Director of Agriculture and the Ohio Soil and Water Conservation Commission to do some things. I think there were some questions about whether or not the results of that executive order could even realistically be accomplished. And I think that's probably one of the things that led to the director's firing, even though nobody has really come out and said. We have varying regulations across the state. Some of you over here, you've got the Chesapeake Bay watershed area. For us, it's the western Lake Erie Basin. That's our sore spot right now in terms of extra regulations to try and deal with nutrient enrichment issues. And so fertilizer in the western Lake Erie Basin is treated a little bit differently. Basically there it says no person in the western basin shall surface apply manure under either of the following conditions: 1, on frozen or snow-covered ground, or B, when the top 2 inches of the soil are saturated from precipitation. Further, you should not apply granular fertilizer when the weather forecast is greater than a 50% chance of 1 inch of precipitation in a 12-hour period. That was one of the things we were trying to address with that record-keeping app that we were talking about in the previous session here this morning, was how in the world are farmers going to know, what that forecast is with any reliability. So, that's one of those issues we were trying to address with those. There were some exceptions. Those rules did not apply if it was being injected, if it was being incorporated within 24 hours, or if it was applied to a growing crop. So those, at least at that time, were kind of the exceptions to that rule in the western basin area. Large livestock operations, these numbers aren't new to anybody. These are pretty much nationwide. All of you deal with the same types of numbers. Our regulations are not unlike probably most other states in terms of the large confined animal feeding operations. Most of that is built around the '76 Clean Water Act and then the subsequent amendments to those provisions of the Code of Federal Regulations. What might be a little bit different in Ohio, I know that in some states your state EPA deals entirely with those large confined animal feeding operations. What might be a little bit different in Ohio is that they have the Ohio Department of Agriculture, and this was back in '02, established their own livestock environmental permitting process. So at that time, they took on all of the site approval and nutrient management planning and manure storage design approval portions of those regulations. The NPDES section or portions of those regulations still resided with Ohio EPA at that time. So that has recently, though, been moved to ODA, and now ODA covers the entire process for those confined animal feeding operations. They look at, through the permitting process, on their oversight for the permitting process, all of the things that you would expect them to: housing facility design, engineering and design of manure storage structures, citing manure utilization and disposal, mortality management, insect control, all of those typical things that you would think about on siting large confined animal feeding operations, they deal with in that permitting process. They run a pretty tight ship. It's a fairly small section in the Department of Agriculture. They have 3 engineering staff and 4 inspectors plus their administrative staff. So a lot of people running that program. Right now in Ohio, we have, I think, 250 permitted confined animal feeding operations. So anything that meets those large livestock numbers and above, there are 250 of those. Now, of course, as I'm driving down 404, I think, isn't that what it is coming in here? Yeah. I see groups of 3 broiler barns, and groups of 3 broiler barns, and groups of 3 broiler. So we've got a lot of that. I'm in Central Ohio. We've had a lot of growth in the broiler industry in our county over the last 7 years or so. So what is it? 125,000 chickens on a dry manure storage facility, I think, is considered a large confined animal feeding operation. So we've got a lot of 3 barn broiler units that hold 24,999 chickens. That's just the way it is. I was in Washington, D.C. last year on a lobbying trip for Farm Bureau, talking to a Farm Bureau president from another county in Ohio who had just finished working with NRCS to put in a large manure storage facility for his dairy operation, and we're talking about it. And he knew that I worked for Soil and Water Conservation District. And so I was like, well, how many cows do you milk any? And without batting an eye, he said 699. So we've got a lot of that going on. What is it? 2,500 head for swine confinement facilities. We've got those barns. Swine confinement facilities and broiler operations are the thorn in our side right now in our county in terms of manure utilization and disposal. So, we've got a lot of operations that are just under the limit. For all of the operations that are permitted large confined animal feeding operations in the state of Ohio, if you are the manager in charge of the waste utilization, or you are a commercial operator that comes in and spreads manure for that operation, ODA has what is called a certified livestock manager program. So all of those people involved in the manure operations have to be a CL. It's kind of not as intense, certainly, as a CCA certification, but a lot of the same things go into it with more of an emphasis on what the rules and regulations are for manure utilization and disposal in the state of Ohio. Record keeping is compulsory for those individuals, so that's one of on the large confined animal feeding operations, that's one of those regular things that they check. They come out when they do the facilities inspection. They also want to see the manure application records and the soil test records for everything that's getting manure from that operation, unless it is sold off the operation. And so, when it is sold off the operation, they're relying on the records of that commercial operator or that CLM that's putting that manure on somebody else's property. Small and medium livestock operations, we touched on this, so 699 dairy cows, 2,499 feeder pigs in a barn. 4,999 ducks. You know how hard it is to find a picture of a duck confinement operation in the United States? That was tough. So our small and medium farm pollution abatement program, it's been around for a while. Step on the edge of things there. It's been around for a while. The first program, first adopted by legislation back in 1973. The first rules for the program were not adopted until 1979, so six years later. They included provisions for excess sediment from farming operations, still do, and silvicultural operations. So timber harvest operations are lumped in with the same pollution regulations as manure and fertilizer application in the state of Ohio. At that time, the violation was a minor misdemeanor, which was $100. I thought one of the innovative things at that time, I'm not quite that old. I wasn't working when they adopted those, but it wasn't a whole lot of years afterwards when I started. One of the innovative things at that time is that the state pollution abatement program for small and medium farms included a cost share incentive program to go out and preemptively apply conservation practices to avoid future manure-related pollution problems. So, we would use that cost share money to incentivize the installation of manure storage facilities, a stacking facility or a manure storage pond, or back then we weren't doing much with milk house wastewater treatment. We still hadn't gotten our heads, wrapped around that issue. But those sorts of things. Rules were updated in '91. Gave some enforcement authority and delegation of nutrient management plan approval to soil and water conservation districts in the state of Ohio. So by agreement, by virtue of an agreement, well, at that time in '91, it was with the director of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. Today it's the Ohio Director of Agriculture. But by virtue of an agreement with the Ohio Director of Agriculture, soil and water conservation districts in the state of Ohio are the ones that go out on the farm and investigate violations of the agricultural pollution abatement program on small and medium-sized farms. So, if somebody calls EPA or the Ohio Department of Agriculture or the Division of Wildlife, they pretty quickly refer those to the soil and water conservation districts, and then it's our responsibility to look into that. On the management plan side of things, the way the Ohio Revised Code reads, if a producer has a voluntarily developed nutrient management plan that has been approved by the Board of Supervisors for the Soil and Water Conservation District, and then somebody files a pollution complaint against them, that nutrient management plan is an affirmative defense in resolving that complaint. But it's voluntary. You would think that everybody would want to take you up on development of a nutrient management plan so that their bases were covered. But it's a voluntary program, and I see somebody else shaking their head back here, and no, by and large, people just don't think about it and don't do anything with it. The Ohio rules for, and this probably varies greatly from state to state, but our non-point source pollution abatement program for small and medium-sized farms is largely a complaint-based process. So Soil and Water Conservation District staff from the 88 individual counties and staff from the Ohio Department of Agriculture are not driving around the countryside looking for active pollution violations. So we're only going out and investigating the ones that we get complaints on. And then this thing happened. Everybody probably saw the news, even over here, you probably saw the news releases having to do with the toxic algae outbreak, the cyanobacteria, blue-green algae issues in Lake Erie, and the fact that Toledo in 2014 had to issue a do not drink advisory, and all of a sudden you had a major metropolitan area, thousands upon thousands of people that didn't have water to drink or use for cooking. And we had all of the pictures of bottled water being trucked into the city of Toledo, and of course, anytime something like that happens, you're going to have a legislative reaction, and there was one, and we'll get to that. So it didn't take them long. A year later, by the middle of the year, in 2015, they had adopted additional fertilizer and manure regulations for the western Lake Erie basin, so not the entire Lake Erie watershed in Ohio, but the western basin that contributes to the western part of Lake Erie there, that prohibited the application of fertilizer when the ground was frozen or snow covered, when the top 2 inches of the soil were saturated, when the weather forecast exceeds greater than a 50% chance of an inch in 12 hours for fertilizer, or a half inch in 24 hours for manure. At that time, and at least at least for now, there still are some exceptions to that, and it was that list of exceptions that applied for material that was injected, incorporated, or applied to a growing crop. Some of that may be going away here soon. Our small farm program was updated again in 2016. The Soil and Water Conservation District program in the state of Ohio had always been provided administrative assistance through the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. In 2016, we completed a move of the code sections for soil and water conservation districts from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources over to the Ohio Department of Agriculture. And at that time they said, hey, while we're at it, we need to do some updates to the pollution abatement law. We're just going to do that at the same time. And so they revised a few things in the Ohio pollution abatement law for the small and medium-sized farms at that time. They added a civil penalty authority to the rules for the Director of Agriculture, which had not existed before. Okay, so we had that, that misdemeanor charge thing going there. No fines in the old process. Okay, there wasn't really the ability to fine a bad actor or an operator until a court charge had been made. Now the Director of Agriculture can levy a fine directly against somebody that's not complying with the pollution abatement law without having to go to court first. So that civil penalty authority was something that was new. And it also went through and it affirmed all of the standard categories that we had for the small farm pollution abatement rules in the state of Ohio. A lot of typical things there: overflow from manure collection facilities, discharges of other wastewaters. A lot of times that would be wash water from an egg wash operation or wash water from a milking center. That would be other wastewaters. Land application, placing and stuffing of soil material. There are a few things in our pollution abatement rules that are very rarely used that I guess people don't understand the scope of the regulation maybe. But sheet and rill erosion, for example, where there's a discharge to the waters of the state. Now, waters of the state in Ohio, that's, it could be a grass waterway, a road ditch, the neighbor's pond, a lake, a drainage ditch, anything, almost any accumulation, surface accumulation of water. So sheet and rill erosion in excess of U.S. standards is technically a violation of our state pollution abatement rules. Got the NRCS agronomist standing back here. He probably understands the scope of that wording in a regulation, but not a lot of people in Ohio probably do. That's a pretty high standard. That's a really high standard, because if you come back to the field office technical guide here or our field office technical guide, the planning standard is T. So in Knox County, Ohio, our soils, that's from somewhere between 2 tons and 5 tons per acre per year soil erosion rate. In much of our county, if you are incorporating tillage of any kind in a corn and soybean rotation, you're probably not meeting that. That would be true in almost the entire eastern half, the southeastern 2/3 of the state of Ohio probably. So that's one of those things that is technically against the law, but we very rarely get complaints. We do occasionally, but from a soil and water conservation district standpoint, we very rarely get complaints on that. Wind erosion that results in contamination of waters of the state. And the other thing that's the most recent addition to the small farm stuff in Ohio that came in the 91 revision was improper composting of animal mortality that results in a discharge to waters of the state. Those complaints invariably start out as nuisance complaints. So we've got improper composting going on. More than likely, going along with the improper composting, we've got some odor issues, and neighbors will start complaining about the odor issues. So they call the Soil and Water Conservation District and say, hey, John Q. Farmer's poultry barn out here stinks to high heaven. My response is, I'm sorry, but odor is not a water pollution issue. I do not have regulations that deal with that. Okay? it's incumbent upon you as a responsible, public official to explain to the public what the rules are in the state of Ohio. So invariably, we get around to this issue of, our rules deal technically with water pollution issues. Okay, fine, click. So 5 minutes later, or sometimes the next day, the phone rings again. It's the same person, and what do you suppose that they are alleging? That there's a water pollution issue from that farm. Okay, so automatically then that triggers, an investigation. I don't have a choice at that point. A citizen of the state of Ohio has alleged a water pollution issue because of the rules. I've got to go out and investigate, even though yesterday they called me and really the only thing that they were wound up about was the odor. And so sometimes we go out and you can have improper composting going on or of livestock mortality and not have a water pollution issue. But sometimes you go out and there's nothing but a big pile of dead chickens behind the broiler barn, and the juice from the chicken pile is going into the stormwater pond, and the stormwater pond's going into the road ditch, and so you kind of know, you understand where that goes. In Ohio, from a mortality disposal standpoint, they can burn, bury, or incinerate. Those are the three acceptable methods for mortality disposal. So fast forward a little bit to 2018, in a draft report issued by Ohio EPA in March, they designated Lake Erie as impaired. Shortly after that, on July 11th, the governor issued an executive order compelling the director of the Ohio Department of Agriculture to seek consent from the Ohio Soil and Water Conservation Commission to declare a number of watersheds in the western Lake Erie Basin as watersheds in distress. And in Ohio, that watershed in distress designation ratchets up the expectations and the requirements on landowners in that area from a fertilizer and manure management standpoint. So the Ohio Soil and Water Conservation Commission is a 7-member commission that in instances like this is intended to be, I guess, think of it as a check, okay, on an arbitrary action perhaps by a governor, any governor over time. The commission's been around since the 1940s. So, a check on some sort of arbitrary measure, trying to be imposed by a governor or maybe a director of EPA or even the Ohio Department of Agriculture. It's a 7-member commission, and all but one of those members is appointed by the governor. So governor's executive order comes out on the 11th. On the 13th, he makes 2 new appointments to the Soil and Water Conservation Commission. The supposition, around the state of Ohio is okay, this executive order thing for the western Lake Erie folks is a slam dunk. You guys grab your bootstraps and pull them up because things are going to change for you in a hurry. And it didn't quite work out that way. But the order impacted an estimated 7,000 farms and 2 million acres in the western Lake Erie Basin. Involved in the process was a updated rule package that is currently under review. One of the things that the updated rule package did was in watersheds in distress, it added the term nutrients to the rule language. Okay, so before, in watersheds in distress, it just said manure, okay? So we were going to broaden that, and then in these areas, it was not just going to be manure, but it was also going to, include nutrients applied for crop production from any other source, granular fertilizer, compost, whatever. We had some arbitrary December through March dates that were in the old rule, and it eliminated those. We had a situation, because of the arbitrary dates, we had a situation where, we'll call it this year, the way it looks outside right now, you could call it early winter, early winter or late winter. You could still potentially be spreading manure on frozen or snow-covered ground, and as long as you were outside of those dates, the regulation didn't apply to you. So it eliminated those arbitrary dates and basically said, if it's frozen or saturated or snow-covered, period, there's a prohibition on it. It would have required, so we don't have required in Ohio, other than in watersheds in distress, we don't have a program that requires nutrient management planning for our small and medium farms. It would have required nutrient management plans for all operations that farmed over 50 acres, applied over 350 tons of dry manure, or over 100,000 gallons of liquid manure. The Soil and Water Conservation Commission, instead of approving the recommendation at their first meeting a month and a half, or 3.5 months ago, referred it to a committee. So everybody kind of thought at that time that the executive order was effectively dead, that the committee would never get back. Governor Kasich's term ends, at the end of this year. That the committee would never get back in time. But they surprised everybody, and they came back to the commission with a recommendation at the Soil and Water Conservation Commission on November 1st. All of the major regulatory players, Ohio EPA, the new director for the Ohio Department of Agriculture, and the Ohio Department of Natural Resources were on board making recommendations to the commission to go ahead and make the watershed distress designation for the western Lake Erie Basin counties.
Does that really say that you can't put anything on it that's urban if precipitation is expected?
Yes.
If in the weather forecast is it within a certain percentage, like 10% chance?
Greater than 50%.
Okay.
Greater than 50%.
So they do have a designation. So you
Yep.
put a chance, 50% chance of rain.
Yep.
Within how many hours you cannot put manure, fertilizer, anything?
12 hours for fertilizer, 24 hours for manure.
All right.
That is a much more lenient standard for fertilizer than it is for manure. So yeah. And so, they voted on it, and actually this rule package that's under review right now, and it comes up for an official hearing next week, November 20th. But since the rule package had not been adopted yet, all of the members on the conservation, to their credit, all of the members on the Conservation Commission they said, look, well, not all of them. It was a 4-3 vote. But enough of them said, look, we don't know exactly. We're not prepared to make this designation until we know what the rule package is going to look like. We want to know what the approved rules are before we decide how we're going to vote on that. So they tabled it until this rule package is finalized. Now, with the governor leaving office here at the end of the year, who knows what will happen. And in all likelihood, Mike DeWine is coming in as our new governor. In all likelihood, we'll have a new director for the Department of Agriculture as well. So, who knows what will happen with it at that point. The rule package will be reviewed and will be probably adopted no matter what. But, at issue is whether or not the designation for a watershed in distress happens there in the western Lake Erie Basin. So I guess the question is, has any of this over the years, has any of this over the years made any difference? And that it just really depends on who you ask. So Chris Winslow is the director of OSU's Stone Lab program. It's a research facility that they have, OSU has up in Lake Erie. He would tell you that 90% of the farmers that he gets to interact with are on board. They know they are contributing and want to be part of the solution, which I think is a positive thought and a positive comment. But if you ask Craig Butler, who is the director of Ohio EPA, in April he told the Columbus Dispatch that the big answer is no. We're not seeing any measurable impact over the last few years in terms of phosphorus reduction. So, we certainly have, the situation in Ohio is that we have two different worlds in terms of nutrient management philosophy, I think, right now, or understanding and acceptance by farmers. I think that the farmers that are in the Lake Erie Basin have been beat over the head, I guess, enough with good nutrient management concepts over the past 4-year period that when I talk to Soil and Water Conservation District or OSU extension staff in those areas of the state, that those people are getting on board with that. In the rest of Ohio, we've probably got a ways to go yet. I'll relate to you in generalities the situation in our county. We've seen a lot of growth in the poultry and swine industry in our county in the past 7-year period. We do nutrient management plans for those. We've got a pretty good handle of what nitrogen potash production is for those operations. We've got some dairy industry left in the county we use. So what we did was we took what we knew to be nutrient availability from our large livestock operations. So these would be large non-permitted farms. So the 2,499 or the 24,999 cow poultry operations and 2,400 head swine operations. Added together the P and the N and the P and the K production for those operations. Called the Ohio Department of Agriculture and said, hey, give us the fertilizer distribution reports for Knox County. We want to know how much commercial fertilizer is sold in the county. So we added that all together. We treated the county like we were writing a nutrient management plan for the county, and we had 3 big fields, one of corn, one of soybeans, and one of wheat. We used average NASS yields for the past 5 years for each of those crops. And when we take that those crop utilization numbers for nitrogen and phosphorus especially, and compare those with what we've got from fertilizer and manure, I'll say we're probably, since you're recording this, we're probably over-fertilizing significantly every acre that's in the county. It's 130,000 acres of cropland, give or take. So we're probably over-fertilizing with phosphorus on average every single acre. Now, of course, there's some of that that's way under-fertilized and some that's way over-fertilized. Probably only 10% of our larger, medium-sized livestock operations have adequate land for disposal. We've got ground that we can move manure around on, but we've got not very good distribution right now. And so that results in over-fertilization in some of those areas. So that's where we're at. Any questions? I know some of you guys, you got way worse regulations over here, some of them. Worse, I guess that's a relative thing, depending on how you look at it. But so that's where we're at.
Questions, comments, discussion?
The state is not, but so in Ohio we have, much to the chagrin of all the rest of us in the state, we have focused a lot of environmental quality incentives program funding to the western part of Ohio. So we've got one watershed in distress, that's the Grand Lake St. Mary's watershed in western Ohio, and then we've got the western Lake Erie basin. And so we've spent literally millions of dollars on EQIP funding in those watersheds over the past 3-year period. And so some of that, there would be some manure transport stuff that's worked into that. But by and large, is the state doing anything as far as funding to subsidize that? No.
That is something that's happening in this area.
Yeah. Oh, and that's something that we need to do. Knox County, Ohio, 330,000 acres. Roughly half of that total is in cropland and pasture, and we've got manure distribution issues. That manure, undoubtedly, effective distribution of the manure is the biggest issue that you've got to address. It's not, but it should be a simple issue, but it's not. But on the commercial side of it, to me at least, that's as simple as not writing the check. Okay, that's easy. If I don't need to put fertilizer on it, write the check. I don't buy. I've got a little bit. I grew up on a small dairy farm in eastern Ohio, so I've got compassion for the guys that have to manage manure and handle manure. There are times manure has to be spread. We've got guys all over the state of Ohio right now this fall. I don't know what they're going to do. We're probably creeping up on 100 of our annual precipitation right now with a month and a half to go. conditions, soil conditions in Ohio are absolutely horrible for manure distribution, and I don't know what they're going to do. I really don't know what they're going to do. Corn and soybean, we still got a lot of corn and soybeans out, so, you know, they're going to, yeah. Yep. The combined sewer overflows. They call those combined sewer overflows, yeah. Yeah. So anyway, thanks for coming. Appreciate it.